Let's Take This Outside with Marianne Iveson, the podcast where she speaks to athletes, outdoor professionals, and scientists about why they connect with nature.
Dianne Whelan is an award-winning Canadian documentary filmmaker, an accomplished photographer, artist, storyteller, author, and public speaker. In August 2021, she completed the land and water trails of the 24,000-kilometer Trans-Canada Trail and is the first person and woman to do so. The journey has been turned into a film, 500 Days in the Wild, which you can now watch on Paramount Plus Canada, and the subject of her next book. She is one of the coolest women I've had the privilege of interviewing. Please welcome Dianne Whelan. Dianne Whelan, welcome to Let's Take This Outside. I already feel like we're like kindred spirits from our preamble before we even started this.
I'm so down with what you're putting out. Yes, absolutely.
We're going to dive right into it, but I always like to describe, I know this is an audio medium, but we do record some video, and I want to describe, where exactly are you recording? Because some of my guests are the coolest. They record in, the most random spaces with, camping gear in the background or the clock, but yours is super cool.
Thank you. I'm sitting in my Rebel Sister Productions film studio, which is what used to be a little barn on the back of my property in Garden Bay, BC. Garden Bay is a couple hours north of Vancouver. Everyone thinks we're an island because you have to get on a ferry to come here, but it's actually the mainland BC. If you look at a map, it's just north of Vancouver. And it's a small town most of the year, but in the summer it gets quite busy with tourists coming up to swim in the lakes and play in the ocean. But yeah, I'm sitting in the studio, and this is where I crank out the films. This is where I work from. I work with people all over the world, but this is my home base right here.
I have to ask because as I watched your doc, your connection to nature is so inspiring, especially as a woman, being able to see how you connected. But I need to know, where did your love of nature begin? How did you grow up?
My love of nature began at birth, basically. When I was about 3 years old, my parents moved to BC from Toronto. So I have very little memory of my time there, but I have a memory of being in BC as a young child. And it was the 60s, and there was an incredible amount of freedom. They moved to a place called Tawasin, which is now a very developed suburb, but at that time was still a lot of ancient rainforest and just the beginnings of housing really showing up there. And my mom and father were both, my mom's Acadian from New Brunswick. She's number 13 of 14 kids. My father is from 11 children, from Newfoundland, and his father died when he was young, when his mother was pregnant with their 11th. So both my parents came from really large families and were young parents when they had me. And I had an incredible amount of freedom because they had an incredible amount of freedom. When you have that many children, nobody's micromanaging your kid's life, right? And so we lived in this, rainforest. And so I, at a very young age, and I think, there were some kids in the neighborhood that were slightly older than me that knew things that I learned from too. There was one girl that was maybe 8 years older than me when I was 4 or 5 years old that was really into frogs and salamanders. And so was I. So I kind of glamped on to this fascination with, we would go to the marsh and gather these tadpole eggs inside this, clear gelatinous kind of beautiful membrane. And then we'd watch these eggs become tadpoles. And then we'd watch these tadpoles become frogs. And I was everything I needed to know about the world at that moment was in the magic of this, what we call transmutation, actually. At the same time, my parents were religious people, are religious people still. And, as a child, they would take me to church every Sunday. And with all due respect to religions, I think it's wonderful. Anything that people can find community and hope in, right on. But as a young girl in these places, I was I really was trying to get a grip on what was going on, and there was no women in any places in there. It was all these men up front. And I just didn't really feel a sense of connection. And then by the time I was 8 or 9, and women come from the rib of a man. No, I came from the womb of my mother. And then as I even got older, I realized, wow, this ritual that they're doing on the altar is about transmutation, about turning bread into something more, into the body of something. And I thought, well, you're actually not really doing that, but that really goes on in nature, all the time with the tadpoles and the frogs and the caterpillars that become the butterflies, right? We see these these incredible acts. And so I would like to say that Mother Nature got my spirit because my parents were taking me into these religious environments. The awareness of something called sacred was in my field, but I wasn't connecting to the one that I was being brought up in. Nature got that, got my spirit. And that's the best way that I can describe it. And I think it did start with the frogs and the tadpoles, and it's never stopped. And even before that, my mom said, Dianne, you haven't changed since you were born. Like when you were born and we were in Toronto, we lived in an apartment. We shared this apartment with my sister. We were all just struggling to get by. And you got put in the carriage. If you started to cry, all we did was put you in the carriage and roll the carriage outside, because as long as you were outside, you were the happiest baby. But the minute we brought you inside, you just didn't like that space. So it just goes to show you that nature nurture thing, I think, is that part of me is quite natural to my who I am. But what I've been really fortunate to do is to honor that. It's so hard in today's world. We're shaped by so many things for everybody to stay very connected to what is the true and authentic expression of who you are. And if you start feeling like you're expressing it and it's not fitting, then there's a lot of effort put into shifting and trying to fit. And I quickly realized I was less interested in that than I was just finding my own strength and being who I am, So I've always been able to honor that. As a teenager, I wanted to go to Outward Bound. I had to wait till I was 19 because my parents wouldn't sign the papers, and most people that went to Outward Bound were being sent there. But I actually wanted to go. Like, I loved this idea of gaining strength and comfort in being able to put a pack on and just go out into nature by myself. Through the phases of my life, as everybody, you go through things that are difficult. And when I've needed to just recalibrate, I've taken time off and I've gone into nature, whether it's like a mountain bike ride to Mexico, living on beaches, whether it's like putting on my backpack and doing a section of the Pacific Crest Trail. And of course, with 500 days, it was like on steroids, extremism, doing this 24,000 kilometer trail. But it's always been where I've gone, and I feel very at home there. Nature is going home.
You've made documentaries on Everest, in the Arctic. I have to ask, what draws you to making films in places that most human beings will never go to? Is it to share that experience with everyone else?
The story making thing is funny. It's like I get lots of ideas. I'm very blessed because I know a lot of creative people that struggle with it. I get a lot. I just write them all down in my book. They're like seeds. It's like planting a garden. You plant lots of seeds. They don't all grow. So with me, when I get ideas, for my stories, and so Everest and Arctic were ideas that I was inspired to go and do something, usually motivated by a photograph. In the Arctic, I'd seen an image of like an Inuit man on the back of a snowmobile with a Canadian flag on it. And I'm like, what's going on here? This is interesting to me. I want to unpack this. And then my curiosity takes me down a wormhole. In Everest, I grew up with a picture of Mallory and also Tenzing. And anyway, these guys, these climbers, I would find pictures of them in Nat Geo and rip them out, Hillary and Tenzing, rip them out and put them in my little journal, right? The first book I ever read was The Hobbit. Like, I've always been inspired also by these adventures, but adventures that are also walkabouts. I was not like, for me, what intrigued me about Everest wasn't like the people that were going for their ego. It was the people that were climbing high to go deep inside. Of course, that mountain has become commercialized now, but there's still purists that are on the journey for that reason. And that always has intrigued me. But also, I'm very intrigued by stories where Indigenous people or Indigenous wisdom is working with technology and science, and in many cases, Western culture. So, in the Arctic, what drew me to that story too was it was like four Inuit elders and two Canadian Army guys that were going into the Arctic on this secret military mission on this incredible, like most northern coastline in Canada. And what impressed me was the Army knew they needed the traditional wisdom of the Inuit elders in order to actually accomplish their goal. And on Everest is the same interplay. The Sherpas are the indigenous people of Nepal. They're originally from Tibet, but they've been in Nepal, in the higher regions of Nepal, for like 1,000 years now. And they too have a very animistic connection, spirituality to their physical environment, like the Inuit, like every indigenous group in Canada. For all the differences between Cree, Mi'kmaq, Algonquin, there are also many similarities, and one of them is this animism. This the earth is sacred, the water is sacred, like the things that are sacred is what sustains life. So I'm always intrigued by this interplay of modern and traditional. And I too can just intuitively sense that what we need to know to survive is this will be a combination of these two things, not, because one has is based on observation over millennia of nature and relationship with nature versus something more scientific and objective or technological. So you need both heart and mind, I guess, is another way of saying it. Maybe two-eyed ways of seeing is another, like looking through both eyes of in order to take people through danger to safety. So that's what calls me to these stories, is like there's certain themes, there's certain ideas, but then they need to stay with me for a long time because I know what it's going to take to make them. Like this film took 10 years of my life, 500 Days in the Wild, but Everest took 5, this land took 5. Like they're not, even with funding and all the processes that are involved, the personal commitment. I mean, you're going to work, if you ever actually looked at your hours to your pay ratio, it's like 10 cents an hour. Like you have to be motivated in a deep and profound way to like see something through. So Everest did that for me. The high Arctic did that for me for sure. Like the physical environments, that's where I feel called to spend my time. I also like stories where, like when I make films, I don't like to say, okay, I'll show up next Tuesday and then I'll see you in a month. Like I like to, when I start making a film, spend 24 hours a day with the people I'm actually filming. I want that kind of verite access. And so again, Everest, this land, and 500 days in terms of myself, but just that you're living the experience that you're documenting. You're not just like coming in, you're like every day living and breathing what the people that you're filming are living and breathing to some extent. So all of these things have to come together for me to like really land on what I'm going to do next, but yeah, they're all based in nature and they're all like The Hobbit, they're all adventure stories with a beginning, middle, and end.
You do kind of remind me of Frodo a little bit in your adventure. So I'm calling you Frodo from now on. By the way, I was privileged enough. Has no one ever called you Frodo before?
No, Gandalf, because of the pipe, but
I figured, okay, I wanted to draw the parallel to Frodo because you said yourself you're not an extreme athlete, but you have this big goal, and your big goal was through the Trans-Canada Trail, which is pretty much like bringing a ring to Mordor. Like, it's the same thing, right? So,
right? I feel like it was myself. And there were, all kinds of different peoples that came forward to help me out, fairies.
Yeah. I do want to draw the connection, by the way. I was privileged enough to do Everest Base Camp about 7 years ago. So in your film, you connected with Indigenous people the entire journey from beginning to end. And I have to say that doing Everest Base Camp with Sherpa and connecting through all the towns and little villages along the way and the temples was the most spiritual experience of my entire life. So it's interesting that it's whether it's in Nepal or whether it's across Canada, it's that appreciation for their land and how they connect and the respect that they have for their land, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it was interesting. I too, because I went to Everest twice. Once was for a magazine and once was to shoot the film. So the first time there, we stopped at multiple monasteries because you're also acclimatizing. And so it's a way of just like different places. And it was amazing. I was filled with reverence. But I have to be honest with you, the second time I went, I was like in one of the monasteries and I just said to the man I was traveling with, can you ask the monk, how come there's no women? Like, when will women become monks? And everybody freaked out, like, oh, don't ask that question. Very bad question. Never, women never. And I'm like, yeah, see, that's the problem I'm having here now. I think this is amazing. I think your vegetarianism and your Buddhism is amazing. But like every other religion, where's the women? right? Like, see, as women, we have fought for political and economic equality, but honestly, whether you're religious or not, spiritual equality of women is actually the ground zero. If you have spiritual equality, then of course you're going to get paid equally. Of course you're going to have political equality because that's just like you are innately on the deepest level. There's an equality and a recognition. So, yeah, it was also a very reverent experience for me and I still respect it, but I do have this critique of it as well. I mean, of all the monotheistic religions that are just where women, I think it's something that needs to be addressed in order for, and what's Jimmy Carter's like one of my heroes, not because he was president of the United States, but because after 65 years of being a devout Baptist, he chose to leave the church and based on their attitude towards women, how the literature had been used to oppress women rather than bring them up. It's very eloquent. If you ever want to read something to choke yourself up, just type in Jimmy Carter, Spiritual Equality for Women. It's a short column he wrote. He went on to write a book about it, but it's amazing. And it, as much as this sounds like it's off topic, it actually isn't because, for me, the earth is mother, right? I have a reverence for nature as I have a reverence for grandmothers and I have a reverence for grandfathers too. I'm just saying like for me, earth is mother, all right? It's this womb from which the web of life, like they're pointing our telescopes all over the universe. And like, I don't want to move to Mars. There's no butterflies or cedar trees there. Like we are a living planet in this galaxy right now of dead planets. I'm sure we'll find other living planets someday. I don't know. But all I know is this is the only one that I know of. And when you look at that picture of Earth from space, that came out of the 1960s. It's like groundbreaking, right? It's like, yeah, there's this blue and green living planet with all this life on it. And we are part of that. Humans are just 0.001% of all life on Earth. That's why when you go out into nature and you spend enough time there, that's what starts to ground you out is you start to reconnect to that other 99%. And you start to remember that it is with, not upon, not on, that we are a part of. And for me, the very fact that the earth is so abused is because it is our mother. It's just the parallels between how women are treated in the earth and how we treat our planet to me are synchronistic. Like they're the same. Then there's this disrespect for something. So, and I say this, I love men. And for the men that listen to this podcast, like I am inspired. Most of, my heroes have been men who have put, used their privilege to help others, and there's a lot of examples of that. So this isn't like, oh, I'm against men. This is just I'd like to have see women have that same space and the importance of that within religion is like to me more from a philosophical and a spiritual place imperative just for the planet to heal and for everyone to heal.
I do want to plug that I chatted with Lakpa Sherpa. She's the woman that summited Everest more than any other woman on the planet. I interviewed her. I was so lucky to interview her. She has a documentary coming. Yeah.
I love her.
Do you know her personally?
I don't. I'm just a big fan because, of course, women, of course, they're going through the same struggle there, right? Like some of the men that I was with, like, you're a bad example for our women, right? Because I was the director of the film. And it's like, even if I said nothing, just that women seeing she's not any brighter than I am and she's doing this, like, they would be like, you're a bad example for our women.
Tell us more about the Trans-Canada Trail, because I'm actually interviewing Mathieu Roy, the CEO, in a couple weeks, which I'm really excited about. Yeah. But I want to hear it from your experience. Was it kind of like a YOLO, I'm going to do this. I've always wanted to do this. So why the Trans-Canada Trail? And tell us a little bit more about it, because it's almost in everyone's backyard and they don't really know much about it.
Well, absolutely. So the idea came up in the 90s that they wanted to build the longest trail in the world that stretched between basically the three oceans, the Atlantic, the Arctic, and the Pacific. So the Trans-Canada Trail right now is a 29,000 kilometer trail. It is the largest recreational trail in the world. It was made up of 487 different land and water trails, although now, because they keep expanding it, it could be more. But at the time that I did it, between 215 and 221, it was 487 different land and water trails. It has 2 mile zeros. One is in Victoria, BC, and one is in St. John's, Newfoundland. I chose to go from east to west because I wanted to follow the light back home. But also, the east is where both my parents were from. So and I'm familiar with the Maritimes. They're smaller provinces, and I knew they'd be like a nice place to kind of break into the trail. What I didn't know was that I'd have a headwind for 6 years. But hey, that's the artist, that's the artist in me choosing to follow the light. I always like to say, what's the hardest way that I can do something? Okay, that's the way I'm going to do it. I mean, clearly not consciously, but unconsciously, I always choose, going from east to west means there's more uphill than downhill, more headwind, but whatever. It was all good. So yeah, it's made up of all these different land and water trails. And to my knowledge, there have been two other people who have walked the trail. Dana Meese walked it, and Mel Vogel, my good friend Mel, walked it. She's from East Berlin. I think Dana took 10 years and did it 6 months a year, and Mel did it in 5 years. But they didn't do the water trails. What they did is absolutely phenomenal. They walked that far. But I was really interested in the water trails. There's 8,000 kilometers, and this is my estimation of what I traveled, 8,000 kilometers of water trails, right from the very beginning. In Cape Breton, you go to the Bredor Lake, and then in Nova Scotia, you do the Shubenacadie River and the St. John River, and then Lake Superior, and then 4,000 kilometer paddle to the Arctic Ocean, and then couple more paddles in interior BC, paddle in Saskatchewan on the South Saskatchewan River, and then Salish Sea to Victoria. So I would say the water trails were my favorite part because they are the most ancient trails on this land. Originally, when the trail was conceptualized, it was to celebrate Canada's 150th birthday, which was officially July 1st, 2017. As a storyteller, but also as this person of settler descent, I wanted to bring a different story to this trail. I wanted to honor that. Like I can honor the last 150 years for sure. I'm a proud Canadian. I love living on this land. And I'm so glad as a woman I live here. I'm afforded rights and protections that I'm not in other places. So yeah, lots of gratitude. But at the same time, I was looking for a more inclusive story, a story that started like 12,000 years ago, because I'm also really aware that, there have been people living on this land for a long time. And archaeology and science of carbon dating has just continuously expanded that understanding. So what's happened is creation stories have been validated now that the Indigenous people in Canada on this land have always shared with people. Now those stories are actually validated with carbon dating. Science is like backing up the understanding of like settled communities. Just because they lived on the water 6 months and they went on the interior 6 months did not mean they were nomadic, much like people have houses in the city and a cabin in the country. So I really wanted to bring that understanding and my own reconciliation journey to the journey. And for me, what I learned it means on the journey is kinship, really just like becoming friends with, getting to know and listening and understanding. So you can also see the world through a different lens. And you have to understand like language, you have to understand how people see the world before you can start having a conversation about something. You have to kind of understand both sides, both perspectives. So that was one of the greatest gifts of the journey. I left in 2015, so 2 years before the trail officially opened. And that was just like the ambitious part of my career, part of me going, okay, like making a film is so impossible anyway. And I left without any funding by giving up all my personal bills. And I had a little bit of income coming monthly from my previous films. I could support myself out there. And then once I got going on the journey, I started applying for grants. And that's kind of how I financed this journey. A lot of I never paid myself for those years. I just bought myself food and, that's it really. I mean, and a lot of acts of kindness from so many different people along the way. But yeah, anyway, that's kind of how that all unfolded, that part of the journey for me. And honestly, too, I really feel that my safety on the journey came from the listening and the learning. one of the first lessons I learned leaving St. John's, Newfoundland, and it's in the film, but this idea that the old way, I really want to travel the old way. So, the old way is a no motor. I'm going to use the canoe, and I'm going to snowshoe, and I'm going to hike, and I'm going to mountain bike, basically all like human energy propulsion. And by time I'm 3 months into the journey, and I've spent some time in Mi'kmaq communities in both Newfoundland and Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, and especially after my paddle on the Bredor Lake, what one of the elders said to me was, Mi'kmaq elders, Danny Paul, he said, the old way isn't the way you're traveling, Dee. The old way is what you carry in your heart as you travel. So as you walk on the land to say the earth is sacred, the earth is sacred. And as you're on the water to say the water is sacred, the water is sacred. If you travel that way, you'll be safe. So I didn't need a rational explanation. I didn't need to break that down and understand how that worked. It was enough to be that someone shared that understanding and wisdom with me for me to like take that in. And for the rest of the journey, and even to this day, when I paddle or walk, I'm not saying like every second I'm in that mantra, but I drop in and out of it constantly, because it's the way that I want to connect to the earth. It's the way that I want to. And, whenever I was afraid, there's lots of little tools people can carry to deal with fear on these journeys. Fear is actually great because it's warning you, be aware, be in the moment, be present, but panic will get you killed. So there's a lot of different tricks people have. A common one is people start counting strokes if they're on the water and they really need to focus and they're dealing with some changing wave action or wind action or storm action. They just start counting strokes, For me, I would just get it. The water is sacred. The water is sacred. The water is sacred. So, and what I found happen over the years by falling into that and honoring something that's so ancient on this land, like thousands of years old, as a way of connecting to the earth, is that I was transforming fear of into connection with. So instead of working against the water, I was with the water, and more like a cork bouncing in it than I was trying to like fight it. And, knock on wood, the least experience I had in any of the modes of travel was paddling a canoe. And I paddled all those years, all those routes, and not once did I end up in the water. I became a very competent paddler by the end. Like I could see looking at the footage, but I really do attribute part of it to listening to these. This is just one example of one lesson that I learned that I, incorporated into my journey. Right. But I actually felt that that's also what kept me safe. It became part of my toolbox for sure. It's how the journey changed me. Those are not just hearing it, but like bringing it into my life and letting it guide my journey, because, your journey is what you carry in your heart. That's what shapes your journey. So it just seemed like if I was connecting to the earth in that way, that would shape the journey in the way that I wanted to, which was I was out there trying to find the most meaningful way to do this, not the fastest way or it was more of a walkabout. Honestly, when I think back at it, 500 Days in the Wild is more of a walkabout on the Trans-Canada Trail than it is. And it's not an athletic conquering of, that's for sure, which is, I think, what people expect, because that's what these kinds of journeys have become. A lot of them have, but that's not what it was for me,
I'm going to take that. The water is sacred. The land is sacred. Not to make this about me, but I just started like swimming this year and open water swimming. And there's nothing more self-regulating, nothing I've ever done than swimming, that you have to self-regulate, right? And like, whether it's wavy or whatever it is, you're like, I could the intrusive thoughts are out of control. I will say that right now, but that like, what's gonna get me? But the water is sacred, and connecting and like being in the moment is like really the only way to relax into it, and connect is the only way that you can actually do it, right?
Right on. That's beautiful. What a cool thing to explore.
Let's Take This Outside now has a newsletter. Keep up to date with outdoor news, events, and great discount codes and deals from our partners. Sign up today at letstakethisoutside.ca.
Something that really spoke to me that's also a common theme in this podcast is your connection to nature. We've talked about it a little bit, but you said something in the film, you did say it quickly as well here, that humans only make up, I don't remember what the exact number was, but
I think it's 0.001%.
of, life on Earth. And you were there to connect with the other 99.99%, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I did. I mean, again, that connection to nature has always been there. And, we're so afraid of it, but nature is going home. It's where we're from. If you're alive today, we all have amnesia, so none of us can do this, but like you could connect your own line back to the beginning of time, right? It's human time. If you're alive today, you're like, that's it, right? We are connected to the past and we are tomorrow's ancestors. So anyway, that nature thing was alive in me as a child, but I think it's alive in all of us. It's like it's just sleeping in your DNA, and if you put yourself out there, it starts to wake up. Like there's a natural kind of rhythm to it that you do start to adapt to, and life becomes quite simple, right? It's about finding water, feeding yourself. Self-care is like, it's so interesting. Like the more extreme the journey, the more important the self-care actually is, even though they're not necessarily synonymous. We think about pushing our limits all the time, but on a journey where it's endurance, it's not speed, it's one of length and time, your capacity to you break life back down to the very basics, and you have to look after all of those things. And then it's whatever you get done in terms of mileage today, but you can't skimp on feeding yourself or looking after your gear, or because they would, you never know when something's going to go sideways. So you always need to be looking after everything. You never work yourself to the point of utter exhaustion, because it could be at that point something goes sideways and now you have no resources to deal with the situation you're in. So it's about adapting that mentality. But anyway, living with nature, and certainly that connection grew as I spent time in Indigenous communities. I found community and really resonated with some of the ways that they connect with nature, for sure, and the respect and reverence for it. But it's always been a part of me, and you can see it. I mean, I was talking to the frogs, I was talking to the butterflies, I was talking to the dragonflies. Were my Jedi warriors. They were the ones killing the mosquitoes. But the more time I spent out there, I could feel a shift in something, I guess you could call resonance. The more comfortable I became, the less fear, because a lot of it was confronting fears at first, right? Fear of being alone, a woman, and nature. And I wasn't afraid of the bears. I was afraid of man, and over time and meeting different people, building that trust, because everybody as different as we were. I always like to joke, people never asked you, are you liberal or conservative or NDP? Like it was irrelevant what your politics are out there. It's just, you could be very different. But the fact that you all find yourself in that same space in the woods is enough to share. Like whether someone's on an ATV and you're on a backpack, there's still something calling you to being out there, whether it's the love of fishing or being in nature and hearing the sounds. And so you find what you share. And that's one of the things I love about it. But yeah, I was never alone. It was the most common question I was asked was, don't you get alone out there? And no, because I had this connection with nature and I was talking with it and being with, I never did. I never got alone at all.
I loved how much you connected with the Indigenous people along the way, the entire way, again, start to finish. I know this was clearly very important to you, and honoring their land and making sure. It was in Victoria, I believe, where you, in the documentary, you're in the canoe and you asked for permission to come on the land. Is that how I remember that correctly? To finish your journey?
Yeah. So I was following a traditional Coast Salish protocol. When boats first started arriving here, they were always greeted because they maintained, there was always people on watch, right, along the shorelines of these communities. And so they knew when boats were coming in because, for centuries before Europeans came, there were other Indigenous people that would come, right? So from what is now Oregon and Washington, the Red Cedar people, all this whole area. We didn't have, from outer space, there are no international boundaries. And certainly for many years, Indigenous people lived here. There was just Turtle Island, right? The entire continent in North America. Anyway, So before I arrived, we had just come out of COVID. So after, you're right, the film only shows you a handful of the communities I actually spent time in. In my 6 years, I spent time in probably 20 Indigenous communities, and a few of those moments are captured in the film. But there was far more than that. And again, I'm a settler descent. I don't know. When I left, I'm not sure what reconciliation was. I knew it was a word. I knew it was like people in our government were talking about it. Like we had an inquiry going on for the murdered and missing woman. And I've been linked to that story since the 90s. Marlena's in the film. I met her when she was 12. Her mother's one of those murdered and missing women, but her mother died in the 90s. And that was like before there was even an acronym in our country for the murdered and missing women, with thousands of murdered and missing Indigenous women in Canada. So I knew all of that was important to me. In fact, originally it was the women, like meeting Marlena and having that awareness. And then over the years, just having that validated, like once my eyes were awoken to it, I saw this racism and prejudice all over the place against, and like if it had been 3,000 murdered white women, you can bet there would be a lot more than going on. Okay. Like, so if that isn't enough to hear, then I don't know what is. And we weren't making a big deal about it, but all of a sudden, like through their own volition, Indigenous communities brought this to the attention of United Nations. This is not cool what's going on here at all. So anyway, all of that was going on within me. And I really wanted to honor Indigenous people on this journey and the ancestors of this land. And I didn't know how, but what I did know was I should go ask, because I don't need to impose my ideas. We've already done that. Like, oh, we're going to fix it. We're going to do this. It's like, yeah, that doesn't work. You got to honor, if you want to do something, you got to go ask. So fortune and fate brought me 6 months before the journey or not even 6 months, I think 3 months before the journey to Haida Gwaii. Haida Gwaii, for those that don't know, is an island in northern BC, and the Haida people have been there for 12,000 years. They've got self-government going on now up there. And so I was invited just 3 months before my journey started to screen my film there. And they paid me to fly there. And it was one of the best film festivals I've ever been in. Sadly, they're not doing it right now, but it was one of the best. As far as how you got treated as an artist, it was like the best I've ever been. Anyway, I went there, and that's where I met Vern. And actually met Diane Chambers, his partner at the time. And I shared with them, both my sadness over the murdered and missing woman. I shared with them just being of settler descent, going on this journey, and how I wanted to honor the ancestors. And that's when Vern gifted me his feather and asked me to bring it on the journey, and taught me how to smudge as a way of cleansing and grounding out on the journey. And I did. And taking that feather was, wow, I had no idea, except, being given this gift, that it was going to shape my journey, because it did. Feathers shaped my journey, because immediately this was like a sacred thing. I could also see how painful it was. Like, this is a man who just met me. He did not know me, and gave a total stranger probably the most important thing in his life, which was this feather. It had beautiful beadwork on the stem of like a lightning bolt. And it was like this beautiful eagle feather that he used in ceremony. He's a healer, and this was a very important thing for him. And yet he gave it to me. So already you have this act of kindness. Imagine meeting a stranger and giving them the thing that you love them. One of the things you love, material things that you love the most, right? So just by that, this was sacred. And so now I had to look after this delicate feather on this rugged journey, and it was a massive undertaking, like beyond my even comprehension in that moment. And there were days where I pulled out feather and I'm like, oh my God, like the feather just looked like it had gone through like a tornado or something.
Yeah.
I would have to be like, oh God, just like sit with feather, kind of like, smooth it out, and realized not too long into the journey that feather was a reflection of myself. Like when the feather looked rough, that meant my self-care was starting to slide, because I wasn't being present enough. So I used that, okay, stop for a day or two, make extra food, give yourself a bowl bath, do some, do a smudge, and just take some care, right? So I had this, and I talked to Feather and, Feather, but it became like this kind of relationship of self, or like a mirror of myself almost. And also, I didn't realize it, but by carrying this feather, but I was also given a paddle by a Mi'kmaq elder named Clifford Paul that had a feather on it that I always carried in my canoe, and even carried when I wasn't canoeing sometimes. And I didn't realize it, but I didn't always know the meaning of these symbols, but other people in other Indigenous communities did. And if they saw these items, there was no discussion of them. But there were doors opened. There was invitations. I also think because I really was not financed out there, that if I had a big Hollywood production behind me, none of that would have happened. There's a lot of respect for artists in Indigenous communities, if as people, not based on finances, it's based on a life path where you're searching for meaning in your life, and you're searching for meaning in your culture. That's part of what an artist does, and for some artists anyway, when you're coming from your heart, and there's a lot of respect for that. So that also opened doors for me on my journey. If I had film crew and, I was like, we've got this, we're selling this, we're doing, like, none of that would have happened, because when you commercialize the sacred, it loses its meaning. I think what they saw in my journey was this walkabout, and there was a sincere desire at finding what reconciliation is, and in my own way make this not like, oh, everybody, this is reconciliation, just follow what I did. No, but just this idea that it is a journey that you have to embark on, and just stripping away all the politics from it, and just simply bringing the word back to what it really means, which is kinship, getting to know one another, holding each other's babies, sharing food. And people were like, well, how do you get access to Indigenous communities as a white person? It's like, well, it's not too hard, really. They all have powwows. And if you go to their websites, often those events are like, hey, the whole community is invited. It's like, how do you get to know anybody? It's like, if you have it in your heart, and you can make that happen. Right. So part of it was just that it was my own journey, but I thought it was important in this discussion that we see people like me going on these journeys, because it brings another perspective to it. And so many people want something. We just don't know the pathway to this shift. You can say, I want this, but how do we bring this about? There's distrust, and this is the story of like 500 years of, but I was always met with grace. I was always met with kindness. And I guess you could say I was always met with forgiveness. But maybe that was because I came with that reverence and that respect in my heart too, right? And that's what I was there for. But yeah, I mean, to heal this land is to find a story that's inclusive of all people, the people that have been here for 12,000 years, and the people that are becoming Canadians tomorrow. Honestly, I mean, it is about finding that story and I guess when you've been excluded, I mean, just as women, it's called history for a reason. It's his stories that have been gathered over the centuries, and good for them to write their own stories. But it's up to us to write her story too, right? We need to write our stories. And as a woman, a story's not a line, it's a circle. And so it's everything and everyone. So for me, anyway, that was just an imperative part of this journey. And I wanted that journey to be attached to this trail. I didn't want this trail to just represent 150 years of Canada built on top of this colonialist history without, there's a way to celebrate a lot of great things. And I want to do that, but I want this, we're just one chapter in a book that's got many chapters in it. And I wanted to touch on that big book. I wanted the many chapters in it, and I'm just so grateful that I had the opportunities and found and met the kindness that I did on that journey.
You've pretty much answered any other question that I had left, other than what do your next adventures look like? Do you have anything that you could share?
Well, I have something burning in my heart, but I'm not going to share it quite yet, because it could be like 2 years before I can even start it, because I guess what's different about me as a filmmaker is I own my own production company, and my production company makes my films. So if you sell your idea as a filmmaker to another production company, your job kind of ends the day your film is done. But when you are the production owner of the production company, then the job doesn't end the day your film is done. I have a minimum of like a serious 1 year back end. Back in the day, even 3 decades ago, there weren't as many films being made in film, and because it was film and it was very cost prohibitive. One of the great things with digital is it's really democratized the storytelling industry. Like, anybody can pick up a DSLR and a microphone and get a digital editing program and you can make a film. So now, the job is you really have to raise the profile of that film. So yeah, I'm in touring with the film. We Oscar qualified the film in LA just to submit. I mean, that's all, we're just playing the game. And all of that is just to raise the profile of the film internationally so that you can distribute and sell the film so that you can actually finance and make another one.
You're like, yeah. I'm still trying to sell this. You're like, I'm still trying to sell this one. I'm not even thinking of the next one.
Oh my God. And then I'd like to write a book. I'm actually really excited to do that. So I've done that on my other documentaries. When I did the film on Everest, I wrote a book called Base Camp 40 Days on Everest. And then I wrote a book on my Arctic film called This Vanishing Land. And it allows me to tell the story I didn't capture on camera. So it's not a repeat of the film at all. It's all those moments where you didn't run your camera, all those other scenes and all those other times. So I really want to write a book on 500 Days in the Wild that will be sort of like both a guidebook for those that are interested in doing it. There'll be some practical information in there because, but also, about stories and vignettes from my personal journey. I've got over 100 journals that I wrote in over those 6 years, and I have barely accessed them. So that's what I'd like to do in the new year. I'm giving this film another 6 months, and depending on what happens. But yeah, my plan right now is to write the book next year. And then once the book is done, then I'll start talking about that next big adventure that I'll be picking away at on the side right now. But yeah, too soon to talk about.
Okay, well, I'll bug you in about a year or two, and we
Please do. And once I start that new one, I won't shut up about it. So, I'll be happy to talk about it. But yeah, I just need to, you need the yin time. Writing is also yin time after the yang time of like all of this, right? It's just about finding that balance.
This has been one of the most beautiful conversations that I've had on this podcast. I feel so honored to be able to chat with you. And you can find 500 Days in the Wild on Paramount Plus Canada, correct?
Yes, that's right. And also I'm on Instagram. So that's the best way. We have a Facebook page and a website, but because I'm a photographer, I'm more apt to just put up a photo to keep people up to date on what's going on. But we are working on a USA theatrical release, more wide release in the States for the fall. So we're out there trying to get it out there to the rest of the world. But thank you. I've also really enjoyed this conversation. It's really been lovely talking to you.
Hopefully I'll meet you at the World Trails Conference in the fall in Ottawa. Very lucky. Dianne Whelan, thank you for taking time today.
You bet. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more Let's Take This Outside, go to letstakethisoutside.ca.
Produced and distributed by the Sound Off Media Company.